Welcome back to America's Commercial Real Estate Show. This segment is brought to you by Valuate Online Investment Analysis. Visit getvaluate.com. Today we're talking about office investment, office leasing strategies, and we have a wonderful guest for you now. We have Mike Lipsey. Mike is founder of the Lipsey Company, and they train and consult with corporations, with commercial real estate service providers, with REITs and institutional owners of office properties. And Mike's here in Studio One. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
Well, Mike, you are in all these offices around the country and around the world. You know, we've all seen at least kind of the latest trends of the WeWork kind of space and the more people per square feet. We've seen kind of open office spaces. What are some of the more recent trends that you're seeing? Is any of this stuff backfiring?
Well, I think of myself as a plumber. I travel 220 days a year. Just this week alone, I've worked Atlanta the last couple of days. I worked Greenville, South Carolina, Gainesville, Georgia the day before. I worked Greensboro, North Carolina the day before that, and Raleigh the day before that. So I spend lots of time on the property with my clients, with the brokers. And let me just tell you a couple of trends. And one that's interesting is one that I forecast 20 years ago. And matter of fact, Jennifer in our office tweeted out something. Here were Lipsey's predictions 20 years ago. I said, if you take an office building should really have sort of three sections. One should be those 5 and 10-year leases make up a big part of your rent roll. Then the second should be those like Regis, you know, that are the incubators. But then you should have something in between that I have been a proponent of for years. It's that 1,500 square foot pre-built, ready to go, no negotiating, take it as is, pay $2 a square foot more than you would traditional space, but it's ready. There's no TI, you move out in 2 years, 7-page lease, not a 37-page lease. You can get a premium, and now we're starting to see that. The space that's tough to lease, let's say on the second floor, that mezz space that's been vacant for 18 months and you're trying to figure out what to do with it. Well, you take that 18,000 square feet and you cut it up into about 1,400 to 1,600 square foot pre-built, ready to go. And people take it as is, and they take it within a week, and they're paying rent 10 days later. So now if you can imagine a stacking plan of an office building today, you see the office suites, very popular. Then you see the 1,500 square foot, and you're incubating those tenants that will eventually become a 2,000 square foot five-year user. So that's kind of how I look at office buildings today, and frequently I'll go into office buildings. We're working on one right now, where we went to the owner and we said that mezz space has been vacant for years. You've generated no revenue off of it. It really would be cool office suite space. So those are kind of some of the trends that we're seeing right now.
And is there a little bit of a pushback from some of these owners, especially institutional owners, about really building out and getting space ready when they don't have a tenant?
Well, not really, because when you think about traditional space, you're going to do $40, $50, $60 a square foot of TI for a 5-year lease. The tenant moves out after 5 years and you rip out perfectly good TI to come back and spend another $50 a square foot. So over a 10-year period, you've spent over $100 a square foot, $50 times 2. Alternatively, you say, I've studied the market, I know what the average user is who is, you know, got a little flexibility, and they don't need build out. They need, you know, private offices, they need a conference room, they need a reception area, and you build that out. You'll only do the build out once. And so now you'll do the build out $50 a square foot, but you won't have to do it in 5 years. Yeah. But here's the real plus. You'll get $2 or $3 a square foot in premium, because now you're able to give flexibility to this user who doesn't need to sign a 5-year lease. They're going to sign a 2-year lease. And for the privilege of doing 2 years versus 5, they'll say, I'll pay a premium in rent. Another benefit. There's no escalations, there's no pass-throughs. All that is pre-calculated in the lease. So now you're able to reduce operating expenses by 38 cents a square foot, because now your accounting department doesn't have to be cranking out base year and escalations year after year after year. So it's a much more efficient model. And then hopefully that 1,500 square foot user grows, becomes a 3,000 square foot user, and then you're going to move them into another place in the building.
And I like your point there. So it's not all the building, it's a portion of the building, because if it was your entire building's like that, then the lenders start worrying about it, and the investors looking at your property say, well, you don't have any long-term leases. I like that. Mike, you mentioned kind of the shared office space, the Regis model. What do you say to a property owner who says, all right, I'm going to take a floor and I'm going to operate that myself. Should they operate that themselves, or should they go with a third party, kind of Regis?
Well, we've worked with Regis for years. When they started off in Europe, we worked with them from the very beginning. And historically, those who run their own, small suite space, not the 1,500 square foot, but the Regis model, it's not successful. And I see it over and over again. It takes a trained staff that knows how to lease, that knows how to run an operation, that knows how to provide infrastructure, and it's not something you want to experiment with. So my experience has been, it's a tough business because it's like the health club business. You're churning all the time. And so you got to be leasing all the time. You got to be marketing all the time. You got to be advertising all the time. And if you've just got one office that you've got office suites in, it's just tough to justify the advertising budget that's required. Just think about the amount of advertising that you hear about Regis. I mean, national advertising. That's expensive. And so it tends to be tough for a local owner to have one office suite and hope to make it successful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Mike, let's say that I'm an institutional owner and I have a 120,000 square foot office building. Yeah. I've got more vacancy than my peer buildings, than my competitors. What are some of the things I might want to look at to see if there's a problem?
Well, the first thing you want to look at is what we call the ratios. And frequently we produce what's called the Lipsey Index. And we do it all product types, most submarkets. And the index is granular. It is, what is the velocity in that marketplace? For example, how many sign calls do I need to get before I set an appointment to show the space? How often do I have to show the space before I generate a proposal? How many proposals do I have to generate before I get a letter of intent? It's quantitative. And I'll take the index and then I'll overlay it on what's actually happening in that property. And 9 times out of 10, if they are substantially vacant compared to their peer buildings, they're not even close to the Lipsey Index. So that's the first thing I look for. So then you need to fix what's happening at the property. Oftentimes you need to change the leasing team. Sometimes it's pricing. Sometimes what's happening is you're $3 a square foot over and they don't even want to see the building. Sometimes your concessions are not competitive. So it's not always the leasing team that's the problem. Oftentimes it's the pricing that the landlord has pushed down the throat of the broker is the problem. So but we now have something quantitative to approach the owner and say, you're not even close to our index. We need to fix a couple of items. And so that's the first thing we tend to study before we start making recommendations.
Yeah, well, that's good because there's some landlords out there that don't even have any of those kind of numbers.
No, wait. None of those landlords have that number. Wait. No. It's 1%. Yeah. And when they see the numbers, particularly, and most asset managers are bright, when they see it, they love it. And here's the reason why. And I know that you're getting ready to ask me another question. Mm-hmm. But let's say the index is, for every 4 tours, you generate a proposal, okay? But now you see your tours go way up. You haven't signed a lease, but the tours go way up. The guidance you give your owner is we should be thinking about changing our pricing. We've got more pricing power. We're seeing more demand. So the reason, once they understand the concept of the Lipsey Index, they say we're able to adjust our pricing quicker, less concessions, more rent if we're seeing greater demand. So those are the early indicators that demand's improving. And then also you got the flip side where you thought you were going to do 4 tours and you're doing 1 tour. Now all of a sudden you need to make sure that, we need to reduce our base rent. We need to give more concessions. We all know recessions don't last 6 months. They last a while. And all good, enlightened landlords know go ugly early, So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but there's more to that story because it's the early indicators of how I should change my pricing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the guests we've had on our show is Jim Picata with Highwoods, institutional owner. You know Highwoods well. We're in the top floor of one of their buildings here in Studio 1 in the Bull Realty office. One of the things that they like to talk about on air is that, look, you tenant reps, we will pay you full commissions and we will pay you quickly. Is that something also as a landlord you might want to look at to see how are you compensating tenant reps and treating them right?
I'm going to tell you a great story. So for years we did work for Equity Office. They had 150 million square feet. And so they hired either Bain or McKinsey, I think it was Bain, to study how they could lease more space quickly. They paid a fortune and Bain comes back and says, here, pay the brokers quickly, pay them full market commissions, and even if it's a renewal, don't fight with them, pay them a market fee because they'll be less inclined to take the tenant out of the building. Now, they paid a lot of money for that study. So I never forget telling my dear friend who was the director of leasing at that time, I would have given you that advice free on the phone. You didn't have to hire Bain to know that. And so I can't tell how many landlords they have to fight with that they want to argue with their tenant reps and they can't take paying the tenant reps. 90% of today's leasing is done by the way of the tenant rep. They're your client. You know, that's how the tenant is your guest, but the broker is your client. Think of it that way, and then all of a sudden you'll start paying them generously and you'll have good relationships with them and you'll take them out to lunch. The first place a good leasing campaign begins is developing good working relationships with the best tenant reps in your marketplace. That's where it starts. And then that way you'll see more tenants. The negotiation won't be as tedious as if you've got an adversary sitting across from you.
Yeah, very good point. One of the things I've seen as a tenant rep is that either the third-party broker representing the office building owner or their in-house people are a little lackadaisical. They're not very responsive. I would say, 80% of the time I'm pretty disappointed with the lack of response, and they just don't move very quickly, maybe just compared to a tenant rep's excitement level. How, as a landlord, as an investor in an office building, do you know if you're leasing people, whether in-house or third-party, are being lackadaisical? How do you find out if they're not being aggressive enough?
It's not that they're lackadaisical. The DNA of a landlord rep is different than the DNA of a tenant rep, as is the difference in the DNA in a capital markets broker, as is the DNA in a mortgage banker. And so the first thing you need to recognize, a good landlord rep is a mechanic. Their DNA is, I'm not going to make a bunch of sales calls. I mean, their natural disposition is, I want to report to you, I want to facilitate, I'll study the lease. Where a tenant rep is making 25 outbound calls a day, they're running at 10,000 RPMs, it is a different personality. And that's why you need to measure your landlord rep. You need to make sure that they understand what you expect for them. Not just call on tenant reps, but we do expect you to call directly on some users. And so that's a whole different discussion altogether. But you got to be realistic. A landlord rep is not a tenant rep, and if they were, they'd be a tenant rep because tenant reps get 2/3 of the fee in most marketplaces, right?
Right.
And so a landlord rep is just a different personality. They need to be managed differently than you would manage a tenant rep. So that's the first recognition.
Yeah.
Now, quickly to answer your question, what we do is we tend to put a younger future tenant rep on the landlord team. That youngin will make the outbound calls and tee up the experienced landlord rep. And the experienced landlord rep is very good at the tour, and they're very good at negotiating, they're very good at documentation. They're just not going to make any outbound calls. I don't care what you do. You can pay them 3 times the fee. It's just not in their personality. So you've got to recognize, how do I construct the team using technology and using my younger brokers to bring more prospects to the building, and then have a good experienced landlord rep manage the mechanics.
I've seen some smaller buildings where the management is also the landlord rep. Might that be a mistake? If the personality is different from a tenant rep and a landlord rep, is also just someone that's doing commission leasing different than maybe a property management personnel type?
Well, there really are 2 discussions within that question. One is, have we decided to go self-leased? And a number of my clients have gone self-leased over the last couple of years, because it's not that they want to save on commissions, it's they want to be able to manage the process more effectively. Now, there's a second part of your question is, if I understood it properly, is a property manager a good leasing agent? In most cases, no. Yeah. They are very good at providing service, they're very good at running operating budgets, they're very good at maintaining and correcting variances, but it's just not in their DNA. So imagine you've got a tenant rep, very aggressive, then you've got a landlord rep that's kind of here. Moving down the continuum, then you've got a property manager who's very good with operations, very good with budgets, but they just oftentimes are a little uncomfortable in the process. Now, where you would see the difference would be in a Regis, where they're managing that office, but they're also very skilled at leasing. You also see it in self-storage, where that manager tends to be good at operations and very good at leasing. PS Business Park's one of our good clients. You would see that kind of hybrid. But in traditional offices, because the buildings are larger, they're more complicated, you tend not to see a good property manager also being a good leasing agent. That would be, sort of an exception.
Yeah, well, that's a good tip. And we're going to take a short break. When we get back, I want to ask Mike about, well, how do you pick a team? How do you pick a broker to do your leasing for your property? And how can you help them increase your occupancy in your building? So stay with us. I'm Michael Bull. This is America's Commercial Real Estate Show.